Why do we sometimes sob harder at a dog's funeral than at a complicated adult human goodbye? It's a small, stubborn paradox. We will stand in a kitchen with a collar in our hands and feel like our chest has been hollowed out, while other losses, messy divorces, estrangements, even sudden human deaths, are met with a quieter, more complicated grief. I'm going to give you 50 reasons why that happens, some tender, some oddly technical, some plain ridiculous, but all of them true enough to explain the wet collar syndrome. This isn't about saying dogs are more important than people. It's about mapping the emotional logic behind why certain losses land with a particular kind of sorrow. Think of this as a guided tour through the ordinary, the absurd, and the aching parts of loving an animal who simply wanted to sit at your feet. We'll move from the things that live in daily ritual to the cultural rules that decide who gets to cry aloud. Some items will make you smile in recognition. Others will make your throat tighten while you try to remember when your dog used to jump into the seat with muddy paws and no sense of shame. 1. They live in your routines. Dogs are built into the scaffolding of your day. Morning leash, kitchen scraps, the ritual of let's go. Losing that structure is like someone removing the stairs, sudden and disorienting. You don't just miss a life form, you miss the choreography that kept you anchored. 2. Their love is immediate and unqualified. A dog doesn't weigh your history, your debt, or your late-night mistakes. They show up with the same enthusiasm whether you've had a promotion or a panic attack. That kind of unconditional positive regard feels like medicine. When it stops, the craving is visceral. 3. They are consistent in a chaotic world. People change, plans flake, friendships evolve. Dogs are boringly predictable, and boringness feels like safety when everything else is volatile. When a predictable safety net vanishes, the grief is proportionally loud. 4. You're the center of a dog's universe. From the dog's point of view, your lap, your shoes, your presence, those are the gravitational forces of their life. Being the entire world for someone, even a shaggy, slobbery someone, creates a weight of responsibility that turns into sorrow when it's gone. 5. They forgive quickly, and you crave that forgiveness. A dog forgives spilling coffee, snapping under stress, forgetting a walk. For many of us, that forgiveness is rarer among people. Losing the place where you could be forgiven by default is like losing a soft pillow you never knew you needed. 6. Their emotions are transparent. Dogs wear their feelings on their faces and bodies, tail, ears, and exhale that's either relief or contentment. Human feelings often arrive wrapped in context, history, and motives. The nakedness of a dog's grief or joy cuts straight through. 7. You're an active caregiver. There's visible effort.
Feeding, brushing, vet appointments, late-night check-ins. Animal care is a series of hands-on tasks. Grief for a dog includes the memory of all those physical caretaking acts. Each one is a small funeral bell. They are non-judgmental witnesses to ugly parts of yourself. Dogs have sat through your worst, crumpled tears, ugly shouting matches, the nights you cried into a cereal bowl. They do not take notes. That kind of witness is rare, and losing it can feel like losing someone who knew you without cataloging you. If this is speaking to you, if you've ever cried over a collar, a muddy toy, the spot on the couch, drop a quick Me Too in the comments. You're not alone in this sausage of feeling. You make life and death choices for them. Deciding on treatment options, whether to pursue surgery or whether to say goodbye at the vet, those are decisions you carry. That choice can produce guilt, second-guessing, and a persistent what-if that turns grief into a complicated, self-directed mourning. Euthanasia is an act of mercy and a trauma at once. Choosing to end suffering is an intimate, painful responsibility. Even when it's the kindest option, the image of that last hand petting can haunt you because you were the instrument of both relief and ending. Caregiving is exhausting and intimate in a way few relationships are. Baths, medications, nights of pacing. Caring for a sick dog involves bodily labor that feels both sacrificial and mundane. The exhaustion becomes part of the memory. You didn't just love them, you labored for them. They die in ways you could prevent, or so it feels. When a dog gets into the road or eats something they shouldn't, the accident feels like a lapse of responsibility in a way human tragedies sometimes don't. That perceived preventability amplifies the grief with a layer of blame. You carry the logistics in your bones. You pock the carrier, make the vet call, hold the blanket that smells like summer.
Those sensory logistical details stick to the body as memory, and each time you see a leash, you get a small stab of recall. Their suffering is visible and finite. A limp leg, the last breath in a quiet room, these are sensory, undeniable moments. Human suffering is often messy and ongoing. The clean, finite arc of a pet's end can make the sorrow more immediate. The veterinary waiting room is a crucible of grief. Sitting among others whose hands are empty, watching the automatic doors like they might spit someone back out, clinics compress grief into a small, fluorescent held space. That compression makes the emotion feel larger than it is. You can't explain its time to them. You can rationalize and debate, but you can't translate quality of life into canine comprehension. Making that human judgment without being able to share it is a form of loneliness that thickens grief. You had to be the adult in their story. Whether the dog was a child's first responsibility or your own last act of tender care, you were the one in charge. Grief carries the residue of that authority. How could my authority not protect them? 18. They are morally simple victims. Dogs don't negotiate morality. If harm arrives, they are the innocent on the receiving end. Compared to human relationships where blame, entanglement, and betrayal complicate feelings, sorrow for a wronged pet feels morally uncomplicated and pure. 19. They are symbols of fidelity and loyalty. A wagging tail is a concise sermon. I stayed, I kept faith. When that sermon ends, it calls into question the promises we carry in other arenas of life, and those echoes deepen the ache. 20. They hold a narrative of rescue and repair. Many adopted dogs arrive with a story of rescue, your saving as much as theirs. That narrative of repair makes the knot of meaning intimate. Losing them can feel like watching the repaired part of yourself fray. 21. Their innocence reframes injustice. A dog's misfortune is often read as a kind of cosmic unfairness. Small creature, no malice, great loss. That moral indignation can intensify sorrow in a way that complex human situations rarely permit. 22. They make grief legible for outsiders. Fluffy died is a sentence people understand without a long backstory. The simplicity of that headline invites visible condolences. Neighbors will bring casseroles because the loss is recognizable, which validates the mourner in an often lonely social landscape. 23. They trigger surrogate parenting structures. Whether you had them as a first parental experiment or a lifelong companion, pet care shapes you like parenting does. Discipline, scheduling, the small humiliations of cleaning vomit at 2 a.m. Losing a pet can feel like a parent losing a child figure, not because status is equal, but because the role you embodied was similar. 24. They forgive, but their forgiveness can also mirror your losses. A dog's unconditional acceptance can amplify your awareness of where in human life you were denied that grace. When the dog is gone, you're left facing both the absence and the places that never offered similar solace. 25. You experience anticipatory grief during illness. Watching a familiar body change is a slow-motion anticipatory grief that lets sorrow seep into daily life before the end arrives. That compound sorrow, loss in advance plus loss at the end, can make the final moment feel disproportionately large. 26. Society gives us odd permissions about what sorrow looks like. Telling someone, my dog died, often comes with an almost invitation to grieve out loud. We've culturally sanctioned pet mourning in ways we haven't for messy human situations. That permission makes crying socially safer at the dog's grave than at the human one. 27. Male grief norms collide with pet mourning in interesting ways.
For many men raised with be stoic messaging, crying openly for a dog can be socially acceptable because the grief is read as sentimental rather than emotional vulnerability about human relationships. The dog becomes a socially permitted vessel for an otherwise policed emotion. 28. Pets are a non-threatening topic for public displays of sorrow. Saying, my dog died in casual conversation yields a soft, uncontested sympathy. Saying, my partner left carries social judgments, unsolicited advice, or the expectation that you'll move on. The relative safety of pet grief allows tears to appear without applause or scrutiny. 29. Cultural rituals around human grief are complicated. Human funerals, family politics, and inheritance disputes create social performances that can censor raw emotion. Dogs bypass much of that theater. There's rarely family protocol about a pet, so your grief can be simpler, purer, and therefore louder.
30. Pets help us rehearse intimacy without the baggage. In a relationship economy full of old wounds, dogs offer a training ground for loving without the same risk of reciprocity failing. Losing that easy rehearsal space for intimacy can make you mourn the possibility of simpler bonds you once had. That's the attachment part. Now, the way responsibility and social rules weave into that attachment is where things get thornier. 31. You project redemption onto their lives. If you ever felt powerless in your family, unable to protect someone small, you can pour repair energy into a dog. That invested fixing becomes a form of redemption. If the dog dies, the redemption feels incomplete, and the grief becomes a grief for the part of yourself you hope to heal. 32. They preserve the version of you you like best. With a dog, you tend to the best acts: feeding, walking, laughing at silly antics. Losing them can feel like losing the mirror that reflected your kinder self, and that loss is mourned as much as the animal itself. 33. Sensory cues are lodged in the brain like landmines. The smell of cheap kibble, the sound of claws on hardwood, the sight of a particular breed at the park, sensory triggers summon memories with surprising ferocity. One whiff or a single sound can collapse you into an instant of grief. 34. They are present during the private, ugly moments. Whether you sobbed into a pillow or swore under your breath, a dog witnessed those times without running a mental ledger. That neutral witnessing is rare, and losing it is like losing a non-judgmental confessor. 35. Pets can be a safe container for trauma release. For people who can't bring their traumas into other relationships, dogs become receivers of emotional spillover. Meltdown in the car, sobbing on the floor, the dog nudging closer as if to say, "I'm here." When dawn, that container disappears. 36. Pets catalyze our best caretaking instincts. Dogs invite us to be nourisher, defender, and planner.
The loss can feel like a failure to sustain those instincts in a specific, personal way, creating a sorrow tinted with self-reproach. I should have done more. I could have been better. 37. The timeline is often compressed and brutal. Some pet illnesses progress fast. What was routine on Monday is emergency by Wednesday. Compressed timelines give little chance to emotionally prepare, making grief feel sudden and violent. 38. The death is often witnessed privately. Where human departures may happen in hospitals with many people, a pet's last breath is frequently in a quiet room, your hands on their fur. That private intimacy makes the memory unbearably immediate. 39. You are often left with physical relics everywhere. A bowl, a bed, a tangled ball of fur. These objects remain as small time bombs of memory. Each relic is a little accusation of absence. This was where they lived. Now it's a museum piece of grief. 40. You can't negotiate with destiny. You can forgive, you can apologize, you can repair with humans. But with a pet, the last act was not a conversation. It was a biological fact. That lack of negotiation leaves a hollow where meaning might otherwise be argued into being. 41. There's a language mismatch. No letters, no calls. Humans leave voicemails, emails, drafts of things unsaid. Dogs leave behavior, snuggles, leash tugs, a favored patch of sun. Without words, you must invent the narrative yourself, which can be heavy work for a grieving mind. 42. The moral clarity can make human complicity sting. A dog's suffering is straightforward. Someone was hurt, the dog didn't deserve it. When humans are involved in that suffering, abuse, neglect, the grief carries righteous anger that burns in tandem with sadness. 43. They remind us that life's small joys matter. Tail thumping at a ridiculous sound, excited rolling in something undeservedly stinky. Dogs teach us to celebrate tiny pleasures. Their absence makes the world duller, and that diminution is mourned like a lost color. 44. You experience public micro-grief rituals. People bring flowers, notes, small treats left at a yard where your dog used to be walked. Those small communal acts validate your sorrow and let it be public in a way that other private losses may not be permitted to be. 45. Pets can be the only consistent attachments for people on the margins. For the elderly, the socially isolated, or those with turbulent relationships, a dog might be the single steady companionship. When that steadiness ends, there's a collapse in the entire social web. 46. They collapse time into memory in unique ways. A dog's life is shorter, and that compressed arc can make their entire history feel like a highlight reel. Every wag and snore is cataloged in quick succession. The speed of that archive can make grief intense because you feel like you lived an entire life in seconds. 47. They catalyze existential questions without language.
A dog's death raises the same flimsy curtains on mortality that human death does, but without the communal theological frameworks people often deploy. You are left with raw questions. What did it mean? What do we owe to those who love us plainly? 48. The finality is sometimes staged by you. Rituals we invent are fragile. We create home funerals, bury collars in flower pots, make altars with photos. Those self-made rituals are tender and necessary, but they're also fragile, and when they fail to grant closure, the grief can feel unfinished. 49. They reveal our limits of control and microcosm. You can plan, schedule, and try to optimize a pet's life, but biology outruns good intentions. That humble lesson in powerlessness is small but searing. It trains your chest to bruise in a particular place. 50. They loved you in a way that required nothing from you but presence. This last one is the small, simple tundra in which many of the previous reasons root. A dog's love often asked only for the simple things: presence, a warm lap, a thrown stick. When that kind of uncomplicated belonging ends, it feels like losing the purest, least bargaining relationship you ever had. That cluster, where attachment and caretaking meet moral clarity, lands heavy. We can see how routine, responsibility, and culture conspire to make pet grief both personal and public. But the story doesn't stop here. The way courts of public opinion, family expectations, and our own childhoods rewrite the script of sorrow is where the paradox deepens. There's a cultural twist that often decides whether we can cry in front of others, a set of rules that let us sob over a collar, but hush up when a family history is messy. Here's a small example. Imagine a man who never cried when his father left home decades ago, but bawls for the dog who slept on his pillow. It's not that he valued the dog more, it's that social rules had trained him not to grieve the father publicly, while pet grief was an allowed, almost expected theatrical outlet. That mismatch between permitted sorrow and forbidden sorrow is part of the social plumbing that directs our tears. We'll dig into that plumbing next, how rituals, gender norms, public performance, and the unfinished business of childhood projection make us prefer certain griefs over others. There's also the way memory and the senses bookend pet grief. A smell can yank you into a midday collapse, and the smallest objects keep the ache alive. But before we move fully into the cultural machinery, note this: none of these reasons aim to rank who feels more pain. They are reasons about form, permission, and immediacy, grief's architecture, not moral judgment. What follows will explore those cultural rules, the projection of old wounds onto new companions, and the way memory and sensory cues keep a dog alive inside us long after their body is gone. We'll look at how guilt and repair twist compassion into complexity, and why sometimes the loss of a wagging tail is the most honest mirror we get. There's a particular social plumbing that governs what we're allowed to show in public, and it tends to favor certain kinds of sorrow over others. Think of these rules as a neighborhood ordinance you never asked to vote on. Some losses get a streetlight and a sidewalk. Others are supposed to be handled behind closed doors. When your tears have a recognized address, my dog died, the neighbors bring casseroles. When your grief is complicated, my brother and I never spoke, someone will hand you a pamphlet called Try Harder. That difference in social infrastructure does a lot of work on why the dog's death often triggers visible weeping where other losses don't. Family systems and etiquette train us early about what's appropriate to reveal. Weddings and funerals have scripts. Pets mostly don't. There's rarely a choreography of blame at a pet memorial. People accept condolences without interrogating motives or past fights. If your cousin dies and there's a long family history of arguments, people will lean into plot summaries of who said what in 1998. There will be a moral audit. With the dog, the narrative is simpler. The dog existed, you loved them, and the loss is tangibly sad. That simplicity makes it easier to cry without feeling like your emotions need to pass a background check. Gender norms plug into this too. For many men, the cultural instruction was never explicit, more like a series of looks and silences about how to manage emotion. In some circles, a man openly grieving a lost partner or abandoned marriage becomes a spectacle of failed masculinity. He's expected to compartmentalize, to convert feeling into action. But a man crying for a dog?
That's sentimental, safe, legible. It's a socially permissible softness. That doesn't make it frivolous, it simply makes certain forms of expression less policed. So the gendered script sometimes directs tenderness towards the species we're allowed to sob for. There's also the way rituals, or the lack of them, shape grief. Human deaths come with rituals that can both help and hinder. A funeral can be a place for mourning and a place for family politics, and sometimes the politics drown out private sorrow. Pets, by contrast, are often mourned with small, personalized rituals, burying a collar under a favorite tree, photographing a sleeping paw, leaving a bowl of kibble as an offering. Those rituals feel intimate and under our control, and because they're compact, they permit a raw range of feeling without the complication of who gets to speak at the eulogy. The cultural permission to express sorrow for animals isn't universal. Different communities and faiths have varying thresholds for public displays of grief, and some of those thresholds overlap with how people are supposed to handle human losses.
But broadly, society has lowered a velvet rope for pet grief. The space behind it is quieter, more private, and more forgiving than many of the stages we set for human mourning. That lowered rope makes tears more likely to pass without interrogation. Another layer is projection, the psychological stuffing we deposit into our animals. People arrive at pet ownership with histories: an abandoned childhood, parents who couldn't hug back, a first heartbreak that never fully healed. Pets become living canvases for those unmet needs. When you succeed at caring for a dog where you once felt helpless, it feels transformative. Conversely, if the dog dies, there's an echo of all the unresolved parts: the child you couldn't save, the apology you never received, the chance to prove you're capable of steadiness. Grief for the pet can therefore be a double-barreled sorrow: loss for the animal and for the repair you hoped it represented. This projection is wildly common and deeply human. Consider the person who adopts an anxious rescue and spends months teaching it to trust. That slow progress is often narrated as proof of personal growth. I made this dog safe. I can be trusted. If the dog's life is cut short, the mourning is not just about the dog's absence, but about the premature end of the demonstrable proof of dog growth. The ache is partly about an interrupted narrative of redemption. Guilt and the what-ifs are a high-velocity engine in pet grief. Were there signs you missed? Could you have found a different medicine, a different specialist? The very fact of responsibility concentrates blame inward. You fed them, you walked them, you were the keeper of their health. Human losses are often distributed across a messy set of actors. Blame gets diffused in systems and histories. With a pet, the chain of care usually has a clean endpoint. You were the one making choices. That concentration makes rumination more acute and private, and guilt is a corrosive companion to mourning. Sensory memory deserves its own paragraph because it's so immediate and ferocious. Animals tie us to senses in an intimate way. Smell is the greatest offender. One tiny whiff and you're back in the living room with a dog who used to press his muzzle against your shin. Hearing is dangerous too. The specific cadence of a collar against tile or a soft growl while you stir a bowl can collapse years into the size of a single breath. These sensory triggers feel like betrayals because they arrive without permission and leave you exposed in any public setting. You could be at a party and a song or a joke about that dog hits you like a current. The brain stores these cues as if they were emergency beacons, and when the beacon goes off, grief is the default response. There's also the clean arc of many pet deaths. Pets age quickly and often predictably. Some losses are sudden and sharp, others are slow motion and allow for anticipatory grief.
Both styles teach us about endings in ways human relationships sometimes refuse to. When a pet's decline follows a visible path, a limp, a missed meal, a visit to the vet, you live months of provisional mourning before the actual death. That anticipatory grief is a strange hybrid of rehearsal and real loss. You're grieving what is still present, which can make the final moment feel like the lost economic transaction in a long-term bankruptcy of hope. Anticipation lets you practice saying goodbye, but it also extends sorrow, sometimes fatiguing you long before the physical absence occurs. Contrast that with ambiguous human losses: a slowly dissolving marriage, a friend who slides away without explanation, relatives who stop returning calls. Ambiguous losses are trickier to grieve because there is no tidy endpoint. Without a clear death, there is no script to follow. You can't hold a funeral for a fading trust. The clarity of pet death, often marked by a date, a clinic, a blanket, is paradoxically a kind of mercy because it gives you something to aim at emotionally. The merciful clarity is painful, yes, but for many people it's easier to process than the unresolved limbo of human estrangements. We should also talk about moral simplicity. Pets occupy a moral register that is usually unambiguous. They are innocent party, rarely morally judged by the community. That innocence permits an outpouring of righteous sorrow without the messy follow-up questions about culpability, motive, or redemption. Humans rarely grant that level of moral simplicity. If you lost a person who is entangled in harmful behavior, the community often insists on debate. How much did they deserve? Without that debate, your grief might be delegitimized or shamed. Pets escape that interrogation, which is both a relief and a deep reason tears flow more readily. Sometimes the dog is a witness to our failure and our triumphs in ways that are unpublishable. In the small hours, people confess things to their pets: anxieties, love notes never sent, fights they lost. A dog who sat quietly through those confessions is a repository of secrets that never became arguments. Losing that private auditor is like losing an untampered archive of your unedited self. You might miss not only the animal, but the safety of a listener who never judged what you'd said. There's a peculiar reciprocity in the way we grieve animals. We often engage in a kind of reparative labor that's visible, measurable, and intimate. Baths, medication schedules, late-night temperature checks. These acts are physical embodiments of love. Grief then shows up not as an abstract sadness, but as a catalog of those tasks you no longer perform. The body remembers the rhythm. At 11 p.m., you used to check the water bowl. At 6 a.m., someone nudged your arm for breakfast. The end of those rhythms is felt in muscle memory, and that somatic grief can be harder to argue with than an intellectual acceptance that things happen.
There's a social comfort in sharing pet grief that comes from its universal recognition. You can say, "My dog died in an elevator," and someone will usually reply with a practiced, gentle empathy. That sympathetic reflex is not trivial. It's a grace. Given that many human griefs are met with bureaucratic distance, the social ease around pets is its own support system. But notice how fragile that support can be if someone else interprets the loss as less than. The person who hears your grief and mutters, "They're just animals," may be trying to diminish your pain because they are uncomfortable with their own. The remedy for that is not to feel embarrassed for hurting. It's to find the people, neighbors, friends, online groups, who will validate the enormity of your small grief. Let's address the elephant in the room. Is crying for a dog somehow a substitute for not processing human loss? Sometimes, yes. People can and do use pets as sideways bridges to deal with unresolved pain. But that doesn't make those feelings fake. If a dog's death unlocks a floodgate of sorrow about a parent who is absent, the flood is still real water, not theatrical tears. Projection and substitution are ways our psyche organizes pain. They're neither morally superior nor defective. They're human adaptations. Another common scene: a person who has been invisible in social systems, elderly, isolated, or otherwise marginalized, relies on a dog for daily structure, companionship, and safety. When that dog dies, the loss is not just emotional, it's practical. The ripple effect impacts medication adherence, social contact, and even the will to leave the house. For someone whose social web is scant, the dog's absence is a collapse of the architecture that supported life. That kind of grief is practical and existential at once. We should also be honest about the odd humor that saves us. People tell irreverent stories because laughter is a relief valve. Jokes about the dog stealing socks, about their ridiculous posture, about the way they stole pizza crusts and got away with it. Humor doesn't make grief trivial, it makes it breathable. It's the same reason you might laugh through tears at a funeral. The absurdity of life presses up against the seriousness of death, and the blend of both feels honest. We are allowed our silly memories alongside our aching ones. At the heart of many of these reasons is a simple fact. Dogs make a kind of demand on us that's profoundly easy to meet. Sit with me, walk with me, throw a ball, be present. Those low-stakes demands build a vast reserve of belonging. Many human relationships require negotiation, apology, and boundary setting,
Animals typically reward basic presence with wholehearted affection. When that uncomplicated belonging disappears, it reveals how starved people sometimes are for relationships that don't ask for much other than presence. In the weeks and months after a dog dies, people create small rituals to hold the loss. Some make photo albums, others buy a new plant to bury a collar under. Some take up a different hobby because their walking partner is gone. These rituals are ways of translating private pain into public signs that say, "This mattered." They're imperfect but necessary. They also show how grief demands meaning-making. We take the chaotic fact of a loved one's absence and try to build a narrative that lets us live with it. And finally, the existential bite. A dying animal forces us to face mortality in a compressed, unornamented way. Because animals don't employ the philosophical strategies humans use to soften death, rationalizations about life's purpose, theological frameworks, social reputations, we're left with blunt questions that land directly. What is this life? What did I do with it? Who am I, if not the keeper of this creature? Those questions are raw and unanswerable, and they produce tears that are as much about ourselves as they are about the pet. If you're listening and thinking, "That's my grief," then allow this. Your response is legitimate. Grief doesn't have to pass a purity test. It doesn't need to be compared or measured against another person's sorrow. Some people will be moved to tears at a dog's grave. Others will sit stone-faced at a human funeral. Both are valid. Both are shaped by history, culture, biology, and circumstance. The point isn't to hierarchize pain, but to recognize the mechanisms that make one kind of loss expressible while another is hidden. Understanding those mechanisms isn't a cure, it's a route to compassion for yourself and for the people around you who behave in ways you don't understand. If you've been carrying a private ache for a long time, whether that ache started with a dog or something else, and it feels like too much, it's okay to look for help. Talking with someone who listens well, whether a friend, support group, or a professional, can provide a different kind of ritual and structure for grief. Saying that out loud is not an admission of failure. It's an act of tending what's broken. There's one more small truth to leave you with. Loving a dog does not mean loving people less. The intensity of a particular grief reveals something about a certain relationship's form, not a universal hierarchy of affection. Dogs often give a type of love that's simple and easy to receive. Humans give loves that are threaded with history, contradiction, and expectation. Both kinds are real. Both kinds teach us how to hold tenderness. So what do you do with all this? You honor the grief you have. Tell the stories, aloud, in a journal, in conversations with people who will sit through the awkward pauses. Keep the relics that help you remember in the places they belong, even if that means rearranging a room so you don't have to see the old blanket every morning. Find small ways to mark the life that mattered. Plant a shrub, make a donation, volunteer at a shelter when you're ready.
And be patient with yourself. Grief is nonlinear and awkward and idiosyncratic. Like love, it refuses to be scheduled. If you lost a dog and that loss feels like an opening into older grief, allow yourself to explore that without guilt. If you never cried for the human losses in your life, but find your throat tight for a pet, be curious about that mismatch rather than shaming it. The aim here is not to produce a tidy moral, but to offer a map. You are not failing your past or your present by reacting in the way you do. You are feeling with the resources you are given. If this piece resonated with you, please share a line in the comments. Maybe the dog's name, or one small memory that still makes you smile. Stories have a way of turning private pain into communal comfort. And if you want more conversations about the strange, soft ways humans attach to one another and to the animals who keep us company, subscribe for more explorations into those odd truths. If grief ever feels unmanageable, consider reaching out to a counselor or a local support group. Many people who work with bereavement find that structured support can help translate raw feeling into a new way of living. Thank you for bringing your attention to this paradox with me. The way we sometimes sob for a dog but not for a human is less a judgment about value and more a story about availability, permission, and the shape of attachment. Whatever your grief looks like, quiet, loud, private, or public,
May it be met with patience, compassion, and a few people who will hold space with you.